but I think it's true.
So you believe that Jesus was
God?
God?
Yeah.
Not that Jordan Peterson is strictly a Christian, but it's popularization through people like Jordan Peterson.
When he talks about religion, I think it's bullshit. I think that he doesn't make any sense at all. I think he's impressing people by using language they don't understand.
Went back in time with a Panasonic video camera and put that camera in front of the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, would the little LCD screen show a man walk out of that tomb?
I would suspect yes.
Richard Dawkins says something completely crazy about religion and Jordan Peterson, so make sure to watch to the end because I have a Bible verse that will tie all of this together. Let's get right into the video.
We were talking about Ayaan Hirsi Ali and it's an interesting detour, but I did want to ask you about this vision of religion for two reasons. This idea that religion, we don't really care about the question of whether it's true that Jesus was born of a virgin or whether he actually died on the cross. In fact, maybe I'm just going to refuse to answer it altogether and say that this is a cultural thing. It's a way of life. It's a motivating reason behind your behaviors. I think that this has got a lot to do with its popularization through people like Jordan Peterson. Ayaan Hirsi Ali seems to have been spending some time with Jordan Peterson and getting on with him, at least in this regard. And I want to ask you about it for two reasons. Firstly, I want to know, you had a conversation with Jordan Peterson. It was for about an hour and a half where you talked about, you talked about some culture stuff, but he's very well known at the moment. He's writing a book at the moment for talking about religion. And he comes at it from this completely different perspective to, I imagine, the perspective that most of your previous Christian opponents, not that Jordan Peterson is strictly a Christian, have come at it from. And I wonder what you make of him and his approach.
I enormously respect his courage in standing up to the Canadian laws about free speech. So I want to just get that out of the way first. I hugely respect that and value him for that reason. When he talks about religion, I think that he doesn't make any sense at all. I think he's impressing people by using language they don't understand, rather like Deepak Chopra. Where people think, oh, it must be terribly profound because I can't understand it, which is not something I can respect. Michael Shermer told me that he tried to pin him down and said, do you actually believe that Jesus was born of a virgin? And Jordan Peterson said, it would take me at least 2 days to answer that. So Michael said more or less, well, how about one sentence or one word? No.
That's crazy. But one thing that you need to understand, he's changed a lot from this video. And actually, he's made some pretty crazy, bold professions of faith that Jesus is God.
And that's how I feel about that. All the stuff about Jungian archetypes, and not that I would be skeptical about that, but constantly dragging them in. I think the most egregious example of that is where he looks at works of primitive art, works of tribal art, where he shows things like two snakes coiling around each other and says, well, they must have had some primitive, primeval knowledge of DNA. Perhaps they looked into their own cells in some sense and saw the DNA. Perhaps the DNA is the double helix is a Jungian archetype. And that is sheer, and I told him so.
Do you think that you can have a productive conversation with him about religion if this is the approach he's taking? Do you think there's any room for progress here, talking to someone like Peterson?
Well, I hesitate to say no about that to anybody, but I have so far I'm not given any confidence, and I want to once again say how much I respect his courage in standing up to the woke nonsense.
Yes, we sandwich the in between the respect. Peterson's approach here seems to have unlocked a new interest in particularly the Bible and, as he calls it, the biblical corpus. My friend Chris Williamson asked him recently on a podcast, because he kept talking about the biblical corpus. He said, when you say the biblical corpus, do you mean the Bible? He says, yes. And I'm thinking, well, why not just call it the Bible then? But he has inspired this renewed interest in the biblical corpus.
Yeah.
Because of that. Because now when you see people debating religion, it tends to be less does God exist and more about the utility of religion and the Jungian archetypes and stuff. The God Delusion, which was the atheist book, do you think it still survives as a sufficient treatment of God and religion in modern culture, if you were to write it again, would you be taking the same approach of talking about it as a scientific issue, or would you feel the need to change the way that you're talking about the subject
I would
altogether?
certainly still talk about it as a scientific issue, because I think that's the most important thing. I probably might add a chapter on the idea of what Dan Dennett calls belief in belief, where the idea that whether you believe it or not, it's a good idea that some people do, and I think that's patronizing. I think that's condescending. It's sort of saying, well, we intellectuals don't need this crutch, but other people may do, and if they do, then it's a good thing because it helps.
Doesn't Richard Dawkins kind of think that way? Like, if it's good for you, then okay. And essentially that's patronizing too. But he's come out with pretty clear statements about God, and I'm going to pull them up here shortly because it's mind-blowing.
Battle against Putin. Well, not that Putin himself is religious.
I think Voltaire said, I don't believe in God, but I hope that my maid does.
Well, that's I didn't know that quote. It's a very good example. And that is so patronizing.
The Diary of the CEO. Ask Jordan Peterson, or what do you believe in? And his answer will shock you.
In a simple way that I can understand, do you believe in a man in the sky God? Do you believe in it's a
Well,
force?
that's not as primitive a conceptualization as the atheists would have you believe.
What is it you believe?
Well, there isn't anything more complex in the known universe than a human brain.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want a model for reality as such, like proclaiming that it has something akin to the structure of the human psyche is not an absurd claim, given that that is the most complex thing by far that we know of. By far.
So what is it you believe?
Well, I've been explaining it.
But I mean,
I mentioned something which we skipped over very quickly because I introduced it too rapidly. The postmodernists figured out that we live in a story, but then they leapt to a faulty conclusion of two forms, well, three. There's no uniting story. That was one of their conclusions. In fact, the definition of postmodernism is skepticism of meta-narratives. There's no uniting story. It's like, well, that's a stupid theory because there's no union. So what? There's just diversity. Well, we worship diversity now in this utterly foolish manner. There's no difference between diversity and war. Without a uniting narrative, there's nothing but war. So, no, that's not going to work. Wrong. Hedonistic self-gratification. There's Michel Foucault for you to a T. It's like, why is that wrong? Why can't people just do what they want with whoever they want all the time? Because it defeats itself and quickly. It's not a sustainable game. If it's all about you and your whims, I don't want to be anywhere near you. And that won't be so good for you. That's not going to work. Power. That's really where the postmodernists landed with their, what would you say, temptation to turn towards Marx. It's all about power. It's like, first of all, that's probably a confession, if that's what you believe. And second, no, it's not. Try tyrannizing your wife and see how well that works for you. Try tyrannizing yourself and see how successful you are. Power's not the game. Okay, what's the game? What's the story? I mentioned earlier, it's voluntary self-sacrifice. Right, you offer yourself up in the service of something higher. That's the basis of society. That's the basis of psychological stability. The Christian insistence is that that's the basis of the world.
I'm going to ask you again because I want to be clear. Is what is the God you believe in?
I think that the claim that Christ is the embodiment of the prophet and the laws, I think that's true.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
That's complicated. It's very, very complicated, but I think it's true.
So you believe that Jesus was
God?
God?
Yeah.
Sheesh! Right there. He says, do you believe Jesus is God? Yeah. And that's something that's very important. Like what it really comes down to. Died on the cross and rose again in 3 days so that you can be saved. Does he put a lot of difficult words into a sentence to make people think and to give the Bible actually more credibility for a lot of intellectuals? But that doesn't change the fact of what he actually is believing. This is where Alex O'Connor presses Jordan Peterson, and he admits that he would even see Jesus resurrect.
A Christian, but I know that a lot of Christians are frustrated when they begin asking about Jesus, who's a much more physical entity, right? It's a real human being. It's someone of flesh and blood. It's someone who's physically crucified by the
It's a
Romans.
very different question. It's a very different question.
And then is seen as a physical entity, at least according to the canonical tradition, by his disciples after he died.
Yeah.
So when somebody asks you, do you believe that that happened? And when I've seen you ask about that question, you tend to still speak in terms of the psychological and the mythological. I think the frustration is that, as you've just said,
these are
two
I don't
different
mind
conversations,
frustrating
right?
Christians in that regard either, because the truth of the matter is, with regard to the gospel accounts, that the mythological and the historical are inextricably cross-contaminated.
Sure.
There's no pulling out the historical Jesus, right? That's a non-starter. And why that is, I don't know. It's very mysterious. It's very hard to understand, as are the, let's say, the accounts of the resurrection. Okay, so what do I think about that? Well, I think that denying the historical reality of Christ I think that's just a fool's errand. I
Of
don't
course.
know why anybody would bother with it.
So a man exists called Jesus. We have
Yes.
that much.
Now, there's a claim that is attributed to Christ that he is the embodiment or the incarnation, the fulfillment, let's say, of the prophet and the laws.
Yes.
I think that's true.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. What does that mean? Well, I think it's in the Gospel of John. I think Gospel of John closes with a statement that's something like, if all the books that were ever
Yes.
written were written about the gospel accounts, that wouldn't be enough books to explain what had happened.
Yeah, if all the
yes.
things that Jesus did.
Yeah. And there's a truth in that. The truth is that profound religious account is bottomless. And the biblical representations are like that. There's no limit to the amount of investigation they can bear, not least because the text itself is deeply cross-referenced. So there's an innumerable number of paths through it. It's like a chessboard. And so it's inexhaustible in its interpretive space.
That's true.
And that's a problem too, because it means it's also susceptible to multiple interpretations, including potentially competing
I
interpretations.
think a lot of people interpret Paul, for example, the earliest New Testament source, as saying that if Jesus did not literally rise from the dead, if there was not a man who stopped breathing and then started breathing again, then your faith is futile and you're still in your sins. That is, Christianity is undermined. Now, that means that, and Paul doesn't say sort of believing that that's false is really bad. He says, if you do not believe this proactively, then your faith is futile.
That's the problem I have with that.
If you don't proactively believe that yourself, then I think when a Christian asks you, do you believe in the resurrection of Jesus? Are you a Christian? I think you must be committed to saying no, at least under that interpretation of Paul. And even if you're not sure, I mean, it's fine if I say to you, do you think that a man physically rose from the dead? And you say something like, well, I don't know. I mean, I wasn't there, but I think it has a lot of mythological significance, or I think that maybe it happened in a different sense, or it happened in the sense that good fiction happens, then fine. But it needs to begin with that caveat of the simple sort of, historically speaking, I don't know. And I know you don't like to pull out the historical Jesus from the mythological,
that's a good objection.
But it's an important question to ask.
No, of course. It's a very good objection. So I just did a seminar on the Gospels with a crew of about 8 people. And it was the same crew that walked through Exodus with me with a couple of variations. And we spent a lot of time on the resurrection accounts, for example. And of course, that was the toughest, morsel to chew and digest. The thing about the resurrection accounts is that they're all, so I could say something like this, which will just annoy people, but it doesn't matter. I believe the accounts, but I have no idea what they mean.
When you say you believe the accounts, do you mean, and I hate to be sort of pedantic here, it seems pedantic, but do you mean you believe that these are things that happened such that that's a strange
thing.
I know you don't like that. Let me put it this way. If I went back in time with a Panasonic video camera and put that camera in front of the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, would the little LCD screen show a man walk out of that tomb?
I would suspect yes.
So that to me seems like a belief in the historical event of the resurrection, or at least of Jesus leaving the tomb, which means that when somebody says, do you believe that Jesus rose from the dead? It doesn't seem clear to me why you're not able to just say, it would seem to me yes.
Let's go. I know I've watched that lots of times, but I'm telling you, he's not just being like this pawn who's playing all these little dumb Christians who just believe anything and want anyone to be a part of their team. There's things that I would say he actually believes. John 3:16 says, "For this is how God loved the world, that he gave his one and only Son, so that everyone who believes in him will not perish but have eternal life." Go to God today and know that he loves you. In the description below, you'll be able to click a link to help you to decide to follow Jesus for the first time. So guys, I encourage you to do that today.